Good morning and good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be part of this inaugural event. My name is Steve Haas, and I'm a PhD researcher in the pharmaceutical industry. For further information on my background, after completing my graduate studies, I first worked at the Office of Research at the Healthcare Financing Administration, which the younger members of our audience might know as the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS. For over 30 years, I've worked in the biopharma industry in various health economics and outcomes research roles. That includes 3 years as the vice president for HEOR at Genzyme, which had a very active rare disease focus. I'm currently leading real-world evidence generation at Sage Therapeutics, and during my presentation, I'll be discussing the intersection of HEOR, rare diseases, and real-world evidence. Before going further, I would like to note that my presentation reflects my own perspective on the topics that I'm covering and should not be interpreted as reflecting those of my employer. So as an overview of what I'll be presenting, I'll start off with a brief description of HEOR and why that research area is concerned with documenting the real-world disease experiences of illnesses and why the audiences are, and who the audiences are for the information that's generated. That will be followed by a discussion of why those audiences require the information. The next two sections drill down on some of the details of what information is required. The first of those two sections will deal with patient-focused drug development and the subcomponents under that label. The second will deal with the generation of information regarding the epidemiology of rare diseases and the healthcare utilization caused by the disease, with those two components coming together to facilitate economic modeling of importance to payers and others. In the last section, I'll talk about some of the sources that are tapped to meet all of those above data needs. The clinical development teams in biopharma companies are focused on gaining regulatory approval. That's clearly the first hurdle to be crossed in providing a new product to help patients with a rare disease. For many years, that was largely all that was needed once a successful clinical development process was concluded. But for some time, US insurance companies and ex-US national health plans have added an additional hurdle that must be crossed before patients can have access to a new product. That hurdle is in the form of requirements for demonstration of the impact of product reimbursement on the economics of the payer, for evidence of product value from the perspective of the patient relative to competing products, and for pre-launch and post-launch real-world evidence indicating that the product will be effective in patients not well represented in a clinical trial. But payers are not the only audience for this type of information, as a number of other roles play a part in providing patient access to new therapies, particularly in the case of rare diseases. Patients need to be aware when a new therapy is available and are particularly interested in real-world patient experiences with the product because they view those individuals as being a better representation of themselves than the patients enrolled in clinical trials. An understanding of that data can facilitate discussions with our physician where treatment with the new product is weighed against the prior alternatives, particularly in cases where the mode of treatment is novel or complex. Real-world data helps physicians better evaluate the potential benefits for their patients because it typically represents a much broader, more representative cross-section of the patients that they treat. Similarly, policymakers and developers of treatment guidelines benefit from this broader representation of the patient population and can help to foster a change in the treatment algorithm that influences payers' reimbursement decisions and the treatment decisions of individual practitioners. And lastly, from a perspective internal to the biopharmaceutical firm, real-world data can help investors appreciate the rationale for the significant investment required to bring a new product to a small patient population. I'm now turning to why real-world evidence is so important to two audiences for this information. Understandably, payers focus their attention on those disease states that drive their bottom line. These are the highly or moderately prevalent diseases that, because of the cost of the interventions involved or due to the associated use of office visits, emergency room visits, or hospital admissions, they have a significant cost impact. Because of this, rare diseases are nearly completely off their radar. Because by definition, in rare diseases, there are few patients for whom a new therapy will be prescribed, in order to recoup the investment required to bring a new product to market, the prices requested by developers can be extremely high. Therefore, when a new product becomes available and negotiations for reimbursement begin, payers have a steep learning curve to understand the disease state and the value of the new product. These negotiations are becoming more difficult because there have been an increased emphasis on the rare disease market in biopharma, because many chronic disease states are well satisfied with the currently available products. Seeing this trend, payers are paying much closer attention to new rare disease treatments. Failure to bring real-world evidence to payers that demonstrates product value makes those reimbursement negotiations exceedingly difficult. That real-world evidence may be in terms of the economics of the overall disease state, or may be focused on the net cost or cost effectiveness of the new therapy based on real-world data. Another key component of the data of interest to insurers is the progression of the disease and the basic epidemiology of the disease state. These factors play an important role in identifying which segment of their covered lives are potential recipients of new treatments, and how long patients may remain in the stages of the disease that involve significant drivers of the cost of care. Additionally, among U.S. commercial insurers, the epidemiology of the disease projects the stage at which patients reach a level of disease severity that qualifies them for Medicare benefits, which removes them from their financial responsibility. Few clinicians have experienced a patient with any one type of rare disease, and even those who specialize in one of the rare diseases may not routinely see all manifestations of the disease, because the patient referral occurs at a later stage of the illness, and or new manifestations require the management of a different specialty. In order for appropriate management of the patients they see, clinicians need to have knowledge of the breadth of issues the patient may face across the continuum of the disease, based on a large sample of data from real-world patients. Of course, the best source of information about the effects of many aspects of the disease experience is from patients themselves. As a result, there is a whole industry that's developed to meet the need to have valid disease-specific patient-reported outcomes. The aspects of disease experience addressed by these instruments can range from the patient's description of their symptoms, to satisfaction with care, how a disease or treatment affects their physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and social well-being, their work productivity, or treatment side effects that they may have experienced. A complication in collecting this type of information in disease states that result in cognitive and functional deficits is that at some point in the disease trajectory, it may be necessary to use a proxy respondent, which makes it difficult to interpret some changes that are observed. The particular dilemma in rare diseases is that because of the rarity of the disease, there may have been little previous work on developing a disease-specific PRO to gain the patient's perspective on their disease. Another issue that occurs with some rare diseases that result in deteriorating function over time is that the issues of importance to patients can also evolve over time. For example, the initial rare disease presentation may be with physical manifestations, which later transition to issues of mental functioning. So it becomes difficult to have instruments that measure and accurately report patient experience as the patient's concerns shift along the disease presentation. Planning for a new study in rare disease triggers a search to identify potential instruments, starting, of course, with the published literature and repositories of instruments. If nothing can be identified, the search turns to clinicians who are treating the rare disease target to see if there are instruments used in their practice which may be appropriate for other purposes. Whatever is found is evaluated in terms of whether it is fit for purpose for the needs of the study. For example, does it address the issues of the patients who will be the target of the study? And is the physical construction consistent with accepted standards for questionnaires? Ultimately, instrument selection is dependent on whether the data will be shared through publication activities, in which face validity is the most important selection criterion, or will it be used in regulatory submissions, in which case the development and validation must meet the requirements of guidance documents from the agencies. I won't go into much detail on the topic of regulatory guidance documents on PRO instrument validation, but I just wanted to make sure you're aware of their existence and share with you that the development and validation of a new instrument whose results can be included in a product label is a multi-step, multi-year initiative that requires a financial investment in excess of $1 million. Use of PRO instruments to collect data regarding the real-world experience of patients can be accomplished in clinical trials, observational studies, and patient surveys. Typically, data from all these sources is required to fully describe patient experience across the continuum of the disease. The richness of this information is such that it can shift our perspective on the value of the clinical outcomes that are typically being measured for the illness, with the critical issue being, yes, an intervention in a clinical trial has been able to demonstrate statistically significant change on a clinical measure, but has it had a meaningful impact on patient functioning, work productivity, and/or healthcare utilization in the real world? To this point, the focus in this section has been on PROs, but there is another research activity that is gaining prominence, particularly in the post-clinical trial period. This is semi-structured patient interviews that help round out the real-world perspective on patients' experience beyond what can be accomplished through the static question and answer format of a PRO survey. That activity allows for probes on why they responded to a question as they did, what topics are most important to the respondent and why, and what didn't we ask you about your experience with the disease that we should have. Quotes from these interviews can be very powerful additions to publications describing the patient experience. Moving beyond efforts to gain information on the individual patient experience of their rare disease, there are several observations of the entire patient population that need to be discussed. One of these is the epidemiology of the disease, which is fundamental to all economic analyses. For decision-making within biopharma and the payer community, the key issues are, of course, How many patients are there who may benefit from the treatment? What are the stages of disease progression, and how long do patients spend in each of these stages? Will the treatment prolong or shorten the patient's stay in the expensive health states? Those questions can only be answered with methodologically sound epidemiologic research from the real world. When that epidemiologic data is built out to represent the real-world economic consequences of the rare disease, there are many perspectives to be represented. Stated another way, there is no single economic model of the disease. The patient perspective revolves around how the illness is likely to affect their out-of-pocket medical expenses and their ability to earn an income across the remainder of their lifetime. Employers are interested in how the illness affects the productivity of their worker in terms of their on-job performance, absences due to symptoms or healthcare encounters, and early retirement. All payers, whether they are a commercial insurer or a governmental program, need to know how coverage for the new intervention will affect the monthly average payment per plan member and whether the benefit to the patient is worth what they're being asked to pay for it. I'll wrap up my presentation by noting that there are a number of different sources that can be tapped to gain information on rare diseases that represented the characteristics of the disease in the real world. While there are certainly issues with the representativeness of patients enrolled in the clinical trials and with the relatively short periods of observation, there are significant advantages to collecting real-world experience data from the participating patients. Beyond the accessibility the trial provides, one of the key advantages is as I mentioned briefly earlier, the ability to understand the relationship between observed changes in the clinical outcome with the real-world implications for the lives of patients across a wide variety of outcomes. Registries developed by individual clinicians or consortia can provide a rich source of information, but they may be limited by the fact that referral to the managing clinicians may occur at a later stage of disease. The patterns of treatment and patient response may be geographically unique, and/or the data captured may not be well aligned with the needs of the research effort. Patient advocacy groups can be excellent partners for the development of real-world data across rare diseases. They have very strong relationships with patients and their families, and those relationships persist over long periods of time because they provide an opportunity for the patient to learn more about the disease and share their experiences and coping mechanisms with others. Many of the patient advocacy groups are interested in fostering the development of more information about the burden of disease, and their memberships are typically motivated individuals who are interested in telling of their experience. Payers can be another group to partner with to generate real-world information about rare disease burden. While data on healthcare utilization patterns and the cost of utilization are an obvious target with this partner, many payers now offer the ability to reach out to selected members of their patients that they cover to gain data through surveys using PRO instruments and bespoke items dealing with topics of particular interest to the research program. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.